Now that I've gone through this, I've tried to read about how others have discovered their partner's infidelity. And my story stands out, at least in the sense that I neither noticed anything strange nor had to uncover it myself. I often go back in my mind, trying to find signs I might have missed. But I can't find anything that should have given me clues. It was on a completely ordinary morning, as I sat in the kitchen reviewing some calculations before heading to the office, that I asked her, "Will you be home for dinner tonight?" I didn't expect an unusual answer. I just asked in passing. She was at the sink unloading the dishwasher. At first, she murmured in that way people do when they're not really paying attention, then replied something like, "No, I'm meeting Aiden tonight, so I'll be home late." I remember how the pen in my hand fell onto the table. I had never heard the name Aiden before that moment, at least not from my wife's mouth. I didn't understand who she meant. I asked, "Who is Aiden?" That's when Mia seemed to realize she had revealed more than she intended. It was as if she tried to catch the words in the air, but of course she couldn't. I saw her jaw tighten, and she looked away. At first, she mumbled something incoherent about how he might be a colleague, but she must have sensed that my silent staring demanded a better answer. I kept asking questions repeatedly. "What? Who is Aiden, and why are you meeting him tonight?" She steeled herself, trying to sound calm, but I could see she was shaken. I think she was trying as hard as she could to come up with a saving lie, but there was no way to talk her way out of it. Finally, she admitted that Aiden was a doctor at the hospital and that they were meeting for work, or however she phrased it. But when I pushed further and demanded she explain why in the world she had said it the way she did, she broke down. I think she realized I wouldn't let go until I had a straight answer. Eventually, the truth came out bit by bit, until she confessed that she had been seeing him for almost a year. She might have used the word seeing, but we both knew what it meant. These weren't innocent meetings. It was a full-blown affair, infidelity, betrayal. Call it whatever you like. Perhaps the worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself, but the feeling that she had deliberately lied for so long, blaming overtime and meetings, while in reality she was spending evenings and possibly weekends with this man. I felt completely numb inside. It was as if my heart stopped beating for a few seconds. I know people often describe it as being punched in the stomach or slapped in the face, but for me, it was more like an icy coldness spreading through me. I don't think I screamed or raised my voice immediately, but I remember asking why, how she could do this to me, to us. She tried to explain that she had felt neglected, that I was always at work, that she had needs that weren't being met at home. She became tearful because she could see that I wasn't buying any of her excuses. I remember saying that I wanted a divorce. It was as if the words left my mouth before I had fully grasped their meaning myself. But I repeated them because I meant them. I remember her collapsing onto a kitchen chair and starting to cry, saying she would explain everything. But for me, there was nothing more to hear. Perhaps it was foolish of me to judge so quickly, but at the same time, I felt that a line had been crossed. We had been married for many years, but in that moment it felt as though she had just driven a dagger straight into my chest. When I saw her crying, apologizing, I felt nothing but emptiness. I told her it was too late, that there was no trust left to rebuild. She suggested we go to therapy, that we could get help, but I just shook my head. I didn't even want to consider it. I was so convinced that I couldn't continue living with her. The betrayal was too great. I left the house without really knowing where I was going. I think I got in the car and drove toward the office. I sat in my room there, staring at my papers, but everything in my head was a mess. I knew a turning point had occurred, that I should really move on immediately, maybe call a lawyer. But part of me was paralyzed. At the same time, my phone rang, and messages demanded my attention, but I ignored them. I took an hour or so to try to gather myself before driving to one of the construction sites to check on a project. Somehow, I needed to keep myself busy, try to control the situation from my professional role. When I got home late that evening, Mia had cleaned away any traces of the day's conversation. She looked completely red-eyed and tried to approach me again. I remember her standing in front of me in the hallway, pleading with me to give her a chance to explain everything. But I just repeated that I wanted a divorce. We raised our voices, at least more than I usually do. I'm not the type to shout, but I think I half shouted at her that she had ruined everything. She became distraught, throwing herself at me and grabbing me to stop me from leaving, but I shook off her hands. She responded by apologizing, but also blaming me for never being present. I kept saying it didn't matter what her explanations were. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. She claimed it was just physical, a game, nothing with feelings or a future like what we had. It was astonishing that she was willing to risk everything we had for something without a future. The next day, I avoided her completely. I left for work earlier than usual. I needed to talk to my lawyer, but I was still in shock. I think I moved in a daze at the office. Somehow I still got a lot done, because I managed to leave all emotions at the door and focus on numbers, project schedules, and supplier contracts. But the thought of divorcing Mia, of upending everything, also scared me. After all, we had lived together for many years. I knew it would be a process that I had to handle practical matters. Then, that same evening, I began to suspect that Mia wasn't just going to accept my decision. Instead, she took it a step further. I received a call from a man. I answered, and he introduced himself as Aiden. Yes, the doctor. He sounded both confident and cold. He started talking about our situation, and I realized he had spoken to Mia. He said something like, "Listen, Lucas, I think we can come to an agreement as adults. Mia feels bad about all this, and I assume you have a lot to lose if you get divorced." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. I asked what he meant, and he clarified, "Think about it. If it turns into a messy divorce, Mia could say she was mistreated, that you ignored her, and then you might lose a significant portion of your assets. You might have to give her half the company." That was exactly how he framed it, as if he thought I didn't know the company was my separate property. I felt the anger bubbling up inside me, but I held it in and let him finish. He suggested that if I just allowed Mia to keep seeing him, that we had some sort of open arrangement, everything could be fine and the divorce could be avoided. I have never in my life heard a more ridiculous offer. Who does he think I am? I was so stunned I couldn't speak at first. Eventually, I told him he must be out of his mind, that there wasn't a chance in the world I would let my wife continue her affair with him. He then tried a different tactic. You know what can happen in court. Judges often consider emotional factors. He sounded like a slimy lawyer, even though he was a doctor. I cut him off. I said, "Enough. I will never agree to something like that. Never." Then I just hung up. The following day, he suddenly showed up at our house. Mia wasn't home, she was at work. I, however, had the afternoon off to prepare for a meeting with my own lawyer. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, and when I opened the door, there stood Aiden in a doctor's coat. He must have been in the area and thought it was a good idea to stop by. Reluctantly, I let him in, mainly to avoid creating a scene on the driveway. He entered the living room and told me, in a voice trying to sound calm, that he just wanted to reason with me like adults. I didn't say much, just let him talk. He repeated pretty much the same thing as he had on the phone, that if I gave him and Mia the space to continue being together, everything would work out smoothly. He presented it as some sort of business deal. You avoid the financial consequences of a messy divorce, and Mia and I can continue our relationship. You and she can still remain married for appearance's sake or whatever you need. And you know you're so busy with work anyway. I don't know what was worse, his complete lack of respect or the fact that he openly boasted about sleeping with my wife. He moved on to direct insults, suggesting I couldn't satisfy her and that he was a more exciting lover. That's when I snapped. I, who usually keep my composure, felt an anger rise within me, an uncontrollable impulse. I punched him straight in the nose. No discussion, no warning, just an explosion of rage. He fell backward to the floor, blood streaming from his nose. I remember him looking up at me with a mix of shock and fear. He held his nose and shouted something like, "Are you crazy?" I stood over him and said that if he even thought about reporting me, I'd make sure his hospital knew exactly what he was up to. Plus, I could always make a home visit to him, just as he had done to me. I told him I had the resources to tie him up in court if he didn't stop his home visits and threats. I think he understood the seriousness because he fell silent. I added that my company, which he so arrogantly thought Mia could claim in a divorce, was my separate property. I explained that it was inherited from my father, that the shares weren't part of the marital estate, and that Mia wouldn't get a single share. It's that I told him that as far as I was concerned, she was single now, and there was no reason for him to come here and get beaten up over her. He could keep seeing her as much as he wanted now. Why not marry her when this was all over? But be careful. I've heard she has a knack for infidelity. After that, he left through the door. Afterward, I sat on the couch trying to calm down. My hands were shaking with adrenaline. I called my lawyer and said we needed to speed up the process, that I was ready to move forward, no matter the cost. He asked if something had happened, but I only said I'd had a confrontation with Mia's lover and didn't want to give him any more chances to try to manipulate me. The lawyer said he understood and would prepare all the documents we needed. I felt relieved to take that step. I was done with any attempts at conversation or negotiation. Mia had crossed a line, and her lover had definitively confirmed there was no reconciliation to be found. Later that evening, Mia came home from work. I didn't bother mentioning the fight. I waited for her to ask if I had seen Aiden. She looked worried and seemed almost to want to avoid my company. Eventually it came. "Lucas, did Aiden come by?" I simply replied, "Yes." She looked at me and asked, "What happened?" I answered briefly, "Ask him." I think she understood that I had hit him. She started crying again and begged me to stop being so harsh to let her explain. I interrupted her and said I didn't want to hear any more excuses or explanations. I had already spoken to my lawyer. She tried to embrace me, tried to ask me to calm down, but I pulled away. She suggested couples therapy, reconciliation talks, a weekend trip, anything. But I shook my head. I said I wasn't going to spend time or energy on it. She broke down. I can't even say I felt sad seeing her cry. I was so tired, so emotionally drained. Maybe it was a survival instinct that made me shut off. In the days that followed, we avoided each other as much as possible. I slept on the couch and she shut herself in the bedroom. We barely spoke except for practical matters like who would pay which bill or pick up the mail. I secretly planned with my lawyer how we would proceed with the divorce. I realized the house we owned together would certainly be part of the settlement, that she would surely have the right to a portion of our shared assets. It felt unfair, but I accepted it. I just wanted to get rid of her. The company, however, was protected, and I knew that very well. As soon as Aiden had tried to threaten me on the phone, I realized how important it was to point out that the firm was outside the scope of a normal marital estate. I had certificates and documents confirming the shares were a gift from my father, and there was no way for Mia to touch them. That realization gave me peace because I knew how hard I had worked to drive the company forward. Then something rather expected happened. Aiden tried one more time, but this time through Mia. She called me during her lunch break and said that Aiden felt we needed to find a solution to avoid the hospital, where he was a senior doctor, finding out about the affair. Apparently, he risked being fired if it became known that he had been having a relationship with a subordinate. I remember responding coldly, "That's not my problem." She said he was desperate, that he wanted to do anything to ensure the divorce didn't become too public, that it wouldn't go to court or become a matter of public record. I told her she should have thought about the consequences before jumping into bed with him. She tried to appeal to my compassion, but I had none left for his sake. I hung up. A few days later, there was another knock on the door, but this time it wasn't Aiden. It was a courier with a delivery for Mia. Ironically, Mia didn't know that her own divorce papers were also on their way to her, but I had instructed my lawyer to ensure they were delivered to her at work. I wanted to make a point, that she could no longer hide behind her secrets. Perhaps it was childish of me, but I was still furious over the betrayal and everything she had put me through. When the courier from my lawyer arrived at her workplace a week later, he handed over the papers unnecessarily loudly, just as we had agreed, so her colleagues could hear. In hindsight, it might have been cruel, but I felt it was the only way to strike back at the humiliation I had endured. Mia called me crying immediately afterward, screaming over the phone that I had ruined her reputation, and that now everyone at the hospital knew she had been unfaithful. I simply replied that she had ruined her own reputation by sleeping with someone other than her husband. Then I hung up and turned off my phone. Day by day, we moved closer to an inevitable breakup. Mia repeatedly tried to stall the process, but my lawyer was skilled and had all the documentation in order. We compiled a list of our shared assets, the house, furniture, car, bank accounts, everything like that. She was entitled to half of what wasn't my separate property, and I had to accept that. I received my share of the home's value, and she got hers. The company wasn't on the list. It was entirely separate and fully protected. During this period, I heard through acquaintances, one of whom also worked at the hospital, that Aiden was in serious trouble. It turned out that as a senior doctor, he was absolutely not allowed to have relationships with staff under him. The rumors had spread when the divorce papers became public, and suddenly the hospital administration was forced to act. They had a strict policy against managers engaging in relationships with their subordinates, particularly when it could influence decision-making or create a hostile work environment. It was exactly the kind of consequence Aiden had tried to avoid when he asked me to keep things quiet. But I had no reason to protect him. As far as I heard, he was either fired or pressured to leave his position to avoid a scandal. In a way, I felt a sense of satisfaction that he had to face the consequences of his actions. At the same time, I almost felt a bit sorry for him losing his job, but only almost. Mia, naturally, was panicked by this development. She called me, desperately trying to get me to withdraw the divorce application to spare Aiden. I asked why on earth I would do that, and she cried, saying she felt guilty that he had lost his job. I pointed out that it was a direct result of their affair and that I had no intention of putting on any charade to save him. She screamed at me that I was heartless. I replied that she should have looked in the mirror when she decided to be unfaithful for nearly a year and lie to me. Then I hung up. Meanwhile, the divorce process moved forward. I signed the necessary documents, attended meetings with my lawyer, and Mia realized she had no chance of keeping more than the law allowed her. She tried to appeal certain points, but my lawyer held firm. Through acquaintances, I heard that Mia was starting to lose her footing at work, that her colleagues were whispering behind her back, and that she was deeply embarrassed. She had been quite popular and social there, but now people were gossiping about how she and Aiden were spending time together after hours. There was a kind of poetic justice in it all, but I couldn't muster much satisfaction. When everything was finalized, the divorce went through. The house and our shared savings were split. I was financially secure regardless. The company remained fully mine, for which I thanked my father. At least I didn't have that anxiety. When we signed the final papers, she left the house, took her things, and disappeared. I watched her walk out the door for the last time as my wife. The last I heard about Mia and Aiden was that they broke up not long after everything came to light. It didn't surprise me. I think their relationship was exciting as long as it was secret, but when it brought shame, rumors, job loss, and a divorce scandal, the fun was gone. Maybe they realized they didn't have a deeper connection. Maybe Aiden was bitter that she hadn't saved him from being fired. Afterward, I spent a lot of time just trying to recover emotionally. I went to work every day, talked to my employees, and handled projects as usual, but I carried a scar inside me that wouldn't heal anytime soon. I considered therapy to process the anger and betrayal, but I decided to handle it my way. I talked a bit with my closest friend, who helped me look ahead. He pointed out that I had every opportunity in the world to build a new life. I owned a thriving company, I was healthy, and I had no significant debts. I appreciated the outcome, but of course it's tough sometimes. I tend to feel bitter and have no desire for relationships. A woman to have fun with? Sure. But a relationship? Not for a long time.
If you liked this story, please subscribe and give us a thumbs up. It helps a lot, and you won't miss out on any future stories. Take care and live your best life.